the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
What an interesting story. Now, some context. It's really easy to just look at the one story and treat it as a contained little thing. But there's been some stuff that's been happening in succession that brought us to this moment. And this is the conclusion of the first half of the book of John, which they think the writer of the book of John wrote the first half and then waited a long time and then wrote the second half later because of how different the two different halves of the book are. So you can say it's kind of like First John and Second John, but not the epistle version. But this is kind of leading up to the conclusion of that first book of the first half of the Gospel of John. Now we've been following through Lent, we've been following Jesus through the Gospel of John, and things have been kind of escalating fast. A few weeks ago, Jesus slipped out of the temple and in Jerusalem after the religious leaders picked up stones to execute him for blasphemy. He escaped, he fled, he stumbled upon this man who was born blind since birth, and he healed him on the Sabbath, which caused its own kind of a ruckus. Then he turned to the Pharisees and he told them that they were the ones who could not see, while the man they had labeled as a sinner, he was the one that actually could see. And they were very offended, wanted to kill him. He ran for his life, kind of a thing. But the conversation didn't end there. From last week's sermon about the blind man, it continued in the next chapter. And it was, Jesus was casting himself as the good shepherd. He's like, I am the good shepherd and I lay down my life for the sheep. And it sounds like a harmless Sunday school lesson, doesn't it? Like Jesus saying, I'm the good shepherd. And then the Pharisees getting all mad at him again. And it's like, what are they so uptight about? Like, why would they get mad about him calling himself the good shepherd? That seems like just something that, kids are going to color that piece of paper in Sunday school. But the language, the good shepherd, is actually soaked in a very controversial passage out of Ezekiel 34, where God indicts the corrupt shepherds of Israel for getting fat off the sheep while the wolves had their way. And the passage kind of ends. It's a really long passage where God just lays into the leaders of Israel over and over again. But the passage ends with God saying, I myself will come and seek and save that which was lost. And so Jesus taking on the good shepherd, saying that he's come to seek and save the lost, is then an indictment of the Pharisees and the religious leaders, saying, I'm the good shepherd, which you know the story, so who's the bad guy in this passage? It's you. So that's why they got mad about that terminology of good shepherd. It was also kind of a semi-declaration of divinity, because God is saying, I myself will do this. And the Pharisees want to say that he's accused of blasphemy and they want to stone him to death. So he runs for his life again. So he ran during the first time, and then he encounters the blind man, has this long conversation about healing the blind man, who's really blind. That conversation turns into the Good Shepherd passage. They want to kill him again. And so he takes off for the wilderness. So fast forward several months, Jesus is back in Jerusalem for Hanukkah, and he's saying more things that the authorities can't tolerate, and they try to stone him again. And he escapes again, this time retreating out into the wilderness east of the Jordan, where John was baptizing. And that's where our story picks up, is these leaders in Jerusalem who have kind of all the power of culture and religion and economy and politics keep trying to kill Jesus, and he keeps narrowly escaping with his life and running for his life. And then all of a sudden, he's out in the wilderness hiding from all these authorities that want to kill him. And he's a wanted man. He's on the run. And word arrives from this small town that's not too far from Jerusalem saying, your friend is sick. Please come. So that's where our story picks up today. But there's the context. Jesus has been hiding. He's been running. He's trying not to get killed until it's his time. He knows that he will be, and he's trying to stretch out that time until the appointed time. And so he's kind of in hiding. But when someone says your friend is in need, something happens. Now, before we get to that town and to Lazarus and that conversation, it's worth sitting with something that this story shows us. we are absolutely uncertain about what it means to be dead. It's kind of like you know it when you see it, but when did it happen? That is something that scientists have been trying to figure out, philosophers have been trying to figure out for a long time. Now, ancient Egypt and even Greece, they believed that the soul resided in your heart, your physical heart. And the Egyptian mummification process, they looked at the brain and they're like, what's that useless sponge up there, man? That's nothing. And they kept all the valuable organs in, like pots and things, and they put them to the side because you would need those in the afterlife. But they're like, that brain, that's just not even that's useless. So they discarded the brain. I won't tell you how because it's gross. But they didn't think that it was needed at all. Then comes Aristotle, and he kind of upgraded things. He's like, well, the brain isn't totally useless. The brain cools the blood, so the heart is still the seat of the soul, but the brain is kind of the cooler of the blood, kind of like rabbit's ears, cooling them off in the desert or something. I don't know why he thought that, but he was like, now the soul in the heart can function properly when your blood is cooled off from your brain. That's not how it works, by the way. Your brain does not do that. Now, Jewish tradition is a little bit different. They believe that your soul resided in two places simultaneously. They're kind of cool like this. They said that the heart is the seat of the soul, your will, your emotions, the things that drive your desires and choices. But your lungs was the vessel of your spirit, because the word for spirit is the same as that for breath and wind. They're the same word. So when you breathe in, you're breathing and filling your lungs with spirit. And then you exhale and spirit goes back out in the world. So that's what they thought, was it was kind of in two places simultaneously. Then in 1628, a lot of time has passed, this English physician by the name of William Harvey, he actually demonstrated that the heart was actually mechanical in nature and that it pumped the blood through veins and all over the place where it needed, not a soul container. So he was like, actually, it has a function to it. It moves the blood around. And I don't know how he figured that out. I didn't want to dive into that because I get a little squeamish with medical stuff. But he figured that out. And then came this guy, the granddaddy of all deconstruction, Rene Descartes. And he shifted the debate to the brain because he was like the I think, therefore I am philosopher kind of a guy. And he was very cerebral. And he's like, the seat of the soul's got to be up here somewhere. And he actually said it's in your pineal gland in your brain because that's the only thing that has one. Everything else in the brain is hemispheric. You got the left and the right, and everything's paired up. But the pineal gland kind of bridges the gaps between the two. And he was kind of like, that's got to be the interface between the immaterial soul and the physical body. That's got to be where the soul resides, in the pineal gland. And it kind of stayed there for a while. And then when we invented ventilators and life support in the 90s and 60s, like medicine needed a new definition for when you could die because we can keep your heart and lungs moving through this technology. So they're like, so where does it reside? So they came up with the term brain dead. And now you have to be declared dead by physical brain waves in some cases. And now there's research speculating that the soul resides in your cells because there's these bacterial things called mitochondria in the middle of all of your cells. And they're thinking that possibly that your life comes from the collection of all of your cells in there. We really don't. That's just a really long way of saying, like, we don't really know where life lives. We're less certain about when it actually departs. Scientists have actually had people, they've donated their lives and said, for my dying breath, put me on this absolute, the most intricate scale possible and see how much my soul weighs when it leaves the body. And when they would die on this scale, they would say how much, weight left the body. And they didn't find anything. So unsure of what the soul is, where it resides, and when is that moment when it actually happens, when you're actually physically gone? And the answer to that question is, we really don't know. Spiritually, physically, we're just not sure. But you know it when you see it. It's kind of like there. But near-death experiences have been a genuine area of research and interest. I nerd out over them. There's a University of Virginia has a whole department dedicated to this topic. It's really interesting. And these are people who are like clinically dead and then are resuscitated back. And they have like these strikingly similar phenomenon that happen, being enveloped by some kind of benevolent presence. They feel a warmth and a light and a love, traveling through tunnels of light, observing their own body from above, being outside of their body. These are the things that people have described. Often they also say that when they return, their entire lives and views on life are transformed. Like it's a fundamental reorder of their value systems and everything. Sometimes trauma is healed and everything. And some neurologists are saying that probably linked to this chemical in the brain called DMT that's released at the time of death, which is a naturally occurring psychedelic that your brain can just produce at the time of death, comparable to like psilocybin experiences or LSD. Same thing happens with your brain. But the science really doesn't really know what's going on there. And Christian theology doesn't attempt to give a complete metaphysical map of exactly how everything beyond the border of death works and looks and all that kind of stuff. But theology offers valuable vocabulary, not coordinates. It helps us kind of have as a signpost pointing towards the great mystery that we humbly say, we're not sure, but we have faith in this general direction. And in today's scripture, we meet somebody who crossed that threshold of death and came back. His name's Lazarus, and his story is really interesting. And he never tells us what was on the other side of the tomb. He simply comes out wrapped in his grave clothes. And his presence becomes so disruptive that the religious authorities of Jerusalem start plotting to kill him again. There's something happening there. What happened in that tomb, somehow it was really dangerous to the powers that be. So that's all of this stuff leading up to this story. What does it mean to be dead? This guy was dead for 4 days. Now, the 4 days is important because Jewish kind of understanding of what happens when you're dead, they believe that your spirit kind of hung out with the body in the general vicinity for 3 days. And then on the 4th day, it left and you were considered dead. So Jesus raising a man on the 4th day was considered a great miracle that couldn't be denied that it happened. So that 4th day was really important. But this text introduces Lazarus with this interesting thing that you could just pass right over it and not even notice it. In the Greek, it says something like, there was a certain man who was sick. His name was Lazarus of Bethany in the village of Mary and Martha. It's like, it goes from like general to very specific. But why not just say Lazarus was sick? Just get to the point. Why we got to run these circles around? There was a certain man and he was sick. And by the way, his name was this and he lived here and he was related to so-and-so. I think there's something theological happening in just that little phrasing there. That's pretty cool. The passive construction was like a certain man was ill. I think that mirrors how we fear God sees us as like a line item or a memo on some kind of divine clipboard, problems in a little bit of a queue. And we're like, how do I get my problem up in the queue? Or did my memo of what's going on in my life, did it get dropped under like God's desk and he forgot about it or something? Right? Like we fear that there's this generality to how God interacts with the world. And sometimes we just get lost in the fray and God's like, oh my gosh, I totally forgot. So-and-so prayed. I should have done something about that, right? And we feel that distance watching the news sometimes ourselves. We hear something, someone was shot, the community was displaced, the family lost everything. We hear that stuff on the news or in our social media feeds. We process it and we scroll on because we don't have a deep connection to the people. But when that same news feed arrives in our neighborhood, at our own address, the abstraction of it collapses entirely. And all of a sudden, it pulls on our heartstrings a little bit stronger. And what I like about this opening of this passage is that the text refuses the abstraction. And it immediately moves from that anonymous to the named, from the clinical to the relational. He's not simply some sick guy and God's on his social media feed being like, oh, wow, that kind of sucks. And then scrolls on. His name is, that's Lazarus. And he lives in Bethany. And he's the brother of Mary and Martha. I know him, right? Like that goes and gets very, very specific fast. Now, the prophetic tradition in Israel consistently warns against abstracting the human condition. in abstracting human suffering, treating the poor and the sick as categories rather than people and humans. And the grammar itself is a theological claim. The God of Israel knows proper names. He knows local addresses of people. I like in the Black theological tradition, to name someone is an act of resistance against the dehumanizing mechanisms of the enslavement empire that kept them enslaved. I love that having their name was so important. And the body has always been both the site of suffering and the site of liberation in that tradition. Whereas the white Western tradition is often spiritualized salvation into an idea that you have to assent to in the mind and agree with on paper. But the biblical tradition insists on this particular body, this person in this place, right? And I think as followers of Christ, we should never be indifferent to the suffering of another human being made in the image of God. We should be drawn to them, not because suffering is God's will, but because God refuses to look away from it altogether. And so we should be drawn to others as well, and drawn to the human suffering experience and say, how can we show up in this person's life? How can we help? And not abstract it away. Now, the Greek word here translated, he was ill, he was sick. That passage is a Greek word that kind of just encompasses all of sickness. It doesn't give us a specific sickness that he's suffering with, but the word there means weakness, powerlessness, feebleness. And I think that kind of encompasses the full condition of the human experience, because we're all mortal. We are all weak. We are all powerless. We are all feeble when it comes down to it. I mean, we can be strong. We can work out. We can be, successful and all that. But it doesn't take much to switch that switch over to all of a sudden you're in need, right? And maybe you've experienced that where you have been going on and life is going great. And then all of a sudden you broke a leg and now you're in bed and you need to be cared for, or something along those lines. Like we get in contact with our mortality in a way that we can most of the time just kind of ignore. And all of a sudden, wow, the reality of our condition is there. So this isn't really a specific diagnosis. It's kind of a broad description of being human. So Lazarus is us. He's you and he's me. He's kind of a stand-in in the story. So we can kind of relate to anyone in the story, it's going to be Lazarus. The Latin phrase memento mori means remember your death. And like theologians, philosophers, poets, writers, sometimes they would keep a human skull on their desk, which is illegal now. Just by the way, you're not allowed to have a real human skull on your desk. Back in the day, they would have that there as a reminder that mortality is the condition. It's not an interruption into life, but the actual condition that we have in life. There's even a country song about it. Live like you were dying. You know that song? It's going to be in your head forever. That's the song where the writer goes skydiving and Rocky Mountain climbing. Spent 3.7 seconds on a bull named Fu Manchu. That's memento mori. That's a skull on your desk, but in the form of a country song. And now it's in your head. Sorry about that. But we spend so much time and energy trying to deny the fact that we're mortal. We pursue power, accumulate wealth, optimize our health, perform our, try to get more competent in the things that we avoid, and to acknowledge that we're fragile and dependent human beings most of the time because we don't like that fact about us. But Lazarus, he's not a case study in someone else's weakness. He's an honest version of us, and the version that we're afraid to acknowledge and show. But he lives in a specific town, and he has a specific purpose, and this text is going to start drawing meaning out of that. Bethany is the town he lives in, and it means two things: the house of figs, or it means the house of misery. So if your name is Bethany, I'm sorry, pick the house of figs. Just pick that one for your thing. But the word Beth is a house of, and then the term Annie means misery, which is really interesting. So what's this town all about? Why does it go to so extent of naming a town that he's in? Well, this town is about 1.5 miles outside of Jerusalem, which is the major seat of power, where the temple is at. It's just over the Mount of Olives. And scholars have noted here that Bethany fits the profile of one of the historic houses for the disabled that the Jewish law required to exist near Jerusalem, but also required it to be placed at least 1 mile away from the city. So there had to be a place of refuge. Now, if we were to go to a different story in a different gospel, in Matthew 26, we see that in the house of Simon the leper, that he is also sick and in Bethany. So it may have functioned as a kind of a group home, a city of outcasts, placed close enough to the capital to satisfy the letter of the law, but just far enough away not to disturb the aesthetics of power. And these places were mandated as refuge, and the community turned them into a place of exile. So the leper colonies weren't a very pleasant place to live. And I think we can do the same. Human beings can do the same thing. Like in our collective attempts to deny mortality and to live at our most optimal, we can actually, in our pursuit of the things that make us feel powerful and productive and exempt from all weakness, we can build our own Bethanies, communal Bethanies, because not everyone can do that. Not everyone, some people have a neurodivergence. Some people have physical disabilities. And they are unable to perform in the optimum settings that our society has created in our denial of our mortality. And so we create these Bethanies and we call them funeral homes for the grieving. That's where the grief takes place. We don't want that in-house over here. Or we put them in the hospital. That's where the sick go. And then when you're better, come out. I'll send some cards, right? We try to distance ourselves from those things because they're uncomfortable. And humans build Bethanies to contain the collective damage of our collective violence. But God moves into those places. This is the cool part of this passage, right? Like we create systems that push the sick, the poor, the doubting, the different out to the margins because we're going to focus in on all the victory stuff here. And then we build these elaborate justification systems of merit and worthiness, correct belief, productivity. And then we trust that if we just work hard enough and conform closely enough, we'll never end up in the Bethany. But 100% of humans just about are going to end up disabled at some point in their life. Some more closer to their passing, but most people will end up there. And most of us are already there because the fear of our own mortality spurs us to create these marginal places we fear to end up in. We might have enough money or health or security to pretend otherwise, but one day it catches up to us. And this story is good news because God moves into Bethany. Christ isn't anointed in Jerusalem halls of power. In the very next chapter, Christ is anointed here at Bethany, in the group home for the sick and the marginalized. I mean, kings were supposed to be anointed, surrounded by the greatest people in the land in the fanciest buildings that you could find. And Jesus is anointed, surrounded by the people that the land forgot and pushed to the side. And this is not incidental to the gospel. It is the gospel itself. And the English language does a disservice in this next section. It says, the one you love is sick. And it says, but Jesus loved him. That seems redundant to me, right? That's because we have one word for love that we put into service of everything between romantic love, between the person that we're involved with, or how we prefer potatoes. I love French fries. I'm a big fan of French fries. I had to give them up for a little while, and I miss them dearly. That's very different from me saying I love my kids, or I love my wife, or even I love my dog. I love my dog in a very different way than I love French fries, right? We have one word that encompasses all those things, but the Greek has 3 distinct words for love. And 2 of them show up in this next sentence. And the contrast between them is the theological point of the section that we miss because we only have one word for it. Here's the passage. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When the sisters send word to Jesus, they say, he whom you love, Phileo, is sick. And the narrator immediately offers a correction, but Jesus agaped Martha and her sister Lazarus. Totally different word. A more honest rendering of that sequence should have said, Lord, your dear friend is sick, but Jesus loved Lazarus and his sisters. Let's look at the difference. Phileo love. It's like friends. It's the love that is shared connection, the love that is loyalty to your people in your tribe, the brotherly love as it is in the city of Philadelphia. Phileo. It's built on like a commonality. And you find it when you meet someone and you realize that you share a passion, or you share a history or a wound or a hometown. And maybe you've said those words, "Oh, no way, you too?" Right? That's a really cool connection point to have. That's a phileo experience, a connection of love that's like, oh, I totally didn't know that. You know, when I learned someone else is into woodworking, I'm like, oh, you too. Have you tried this technique? You know, like it's a fun connection. It's real, beautiful, but it has limits. You may have encountered that limit, right? You were grieving too much. You were struggling too visibly. You're changing and evolving in your mind and heart too fast. And then all of a sudden your needs became inconvenient. Your questions became threatening. And you were no longer so much fun to be around. And all of a sudden that phileo love started to be like, let's not invite so-and-so to the outing. You know, they've kind of been a little skunky lately. And slowly that phileo friends can withdraw on us. The calls stop. The silence gathers. You got ghosted. Then you find out that they hung out without you. And you're like, they did that? See, when Lazarus becomes sick, weak, dependent, no longer able to reciprocate, the question arose whether phileo love's going to be enough to hold him together. And the answer is simple. It wasn't. So it says that correction, Jesus loved, agaped Lazarus. Now, agape love is different. It's seen in my favorite film of all time, Lord of the Rings. It's not built on what we share. Agape love is built on the character of the one who loves. And it's supposed to be unconditional, self-sacrificial, that moves towards the other person at personal cost to themselves. Like Samwise carrying Frodo up the slopes of Mount Doom. Not because Frodo was offering him something in return, but because Sam decided who he was going to be. I am going to be the friend that sticks with you through thick and thin. The philosopher and cognitive scientist, John Vervaeke, really cool guy, he argued that agape love represents Christianity's singular contribution to the human moral consciousness. Like we have been developing, our minds have been evolving for a long time. And you can see it through all of the literature of all the age. And you look back how our mind has developed. And when this guy looked at what did Christianity contribute to the evolution of human consciousness, he was like, hands down, it's that agape love. The idea that love can be directed towards the other, not merely towards those who mirror us and reinforce us or benefit us. It changed our brains. It's a love that transformed the very identity of the person that receives it and makes them part of the family. And we have been largely tribal for most of the human history. We love and protect our in-group, our family, our nation, our denomination, our religion, our political party, our friend group. Those are our peoples, right? But when someone within that tribe begins to diverge through sickness or doubt or shifting theology or changing values, phileo kind of dries up. And the cost of continued inclusion exceeds what shared identity can bear. So we build a Bethany for them and sometimes even for ourselves and saying, I don't fit anymore. But agape love creates that inclusive space. It says that Jesus waited 2 days where he was after he got word. And I find that confusing. It's like, your dear friend is sick. It's like, let me correct that. The one I love is sick. And so he waits 2 days until he dies and then shows up. That's disturbing. It's like, Jesus is kind of like, not yet, not yet. All right, let's go. Why does it do that? Why does a story let that happen? He was just told that Lazarus is sick. He's identified him as someone that he agapes, that he loves. And Jesus stays where he's at for 2 more days. And Lazarus dies because of that apparent procrastination. Now, this is not a storytelling technique. This is a description of how life and faith actually works. And it can be kind of disorienting because I wonder where God is during those long stretches of my life where I'm struggling. I get angry at that silence. I feel despair when the way I imagine God should be acting isn't matching what is actually happening on the ground in my own life. And the sisters send word, and Jesus knew, and Jesus stayed, and Lazarus died anyway. The invitation embedded in this apparent incongruity that Jesus loved and yet didn't show up is not to resolve it too quickly and try and answer the question of why, but to kind of sit inside of it long enough to ask, what is it showing us? And the problem may not be in God's inaction. The problem might be in actually that gap between the kind of love that we want, the controlling love that manages outcomes and prevents suffering and rescues us from all discomfort, and the kind of love that God is. A humble agape that does not manage from a distance, but enters into the grief and stands at the tomb and weeps. A love that shows up not to rescue, but to accompany through it to the resurrection. God lives in these Bethany spaces, even the ones we make for ourselves. God is anointed in Bethany. Now, this is not some consolidation prize. This is like the location of how the kingdom comes about. And Jesus risks everything to go to Bethany. If you look at it in a human perspective, it's a terrible idea. Thomas even knows this is a terrible idea. And he almost is like, well, let's go die. We know what's going to happen if we get that close to Jerusalem. Let's go and die with Jesus. But Jesus goes anyway, even though by any political religious calculus, it's a terrible, terrible idea. The religious leaders of Jerusalem, they're just 2 miles away. They've already attempted to execute him twice. Going to Bethany means moving towards them, and it also risks ritual impurity. Contact with the sick or dead would render him ceremonially unclean, unable to go to the Passover, which was just around the corner, and is the most important worship season of their year. And being seen in Bethany is also going to be like, oh, he's with those people. The sick, the marginalized, the ones respectable society had carefully moved out of view, right? Phileo love can't afford to have your reputation questioned. You got to protect it. It's built on tribal affiliations remaining intact, but agape overrides that fear of tribalism, and Jesus goes there anyways. And I think a lot of the exodus from the Christian communities in our current generations right now is not primarily because the world is winning and evil is out competing godly ethics, like the Christian nationalists say. I don't think that's it at all. I think it's probably because church spaces have held too tightly to its Jerusalem values of power while people are suffering in Bethanies all around. And you've probably felt that. Right? There's like a death grip on doctrines of power and hierarchies of belonging instead of on the person of Christ to be found in these places of Bethany. And people are finding there is just no longer room for them inside many of religious spaces and walls. As Gustavo Gutierrez said, solidarity with the poor means to make the concerns of the poor our own. To prefer the poor is not to exclude others who aren't poor. It's to embrace the whole of humanity beginning from the bottom instead of the top. And that's one of the reasons I experimented with the parish concept of pastoring when I came here, expanding spiritual responsibilities, not just inside these walls, but to the neighborhood that the church is within, not just the bodies that show up on Sunday. But I also want to be honest and humble because I know that many people naturally adjust who they are in religious spaces out of fear. And we stuff doubts into corners of our psyche. We tuck away major shifts in our understanding, theological, political, or personal. And we ask the questions like, what would they say if they knew what I actually thought about, fill in the blank? And we create an interior Bethany, a private exile for a piece of our soul, and send places of ourselves there that we're afraid won't be accepted in spaces like these. Lazarus is the story that says, may it not be that way. Jesus arrives at the tomb, then comes the shortest verse in the whole Bible and probably one of the most theologically rich. Jesus wept. His body registers grief before he performs a miracle. Embodied compassion precedes resurrection. He doesn't manage the moment from a distance. He enters inside of it. When Jesus declares, I am the resurrection and the life, he's not saying, I will be one day the resurrection and life. He says, I am, which is that divine name given to Moses from the burning shrub in the book of Exodus. And it echoes throughout John's gospel. And it's always tethered to immediate presence of God in this moment here. It's not a promise deferred to the end of time or afterwards later. It's a present tense encounter with God. Death took Lazarus for 4 days. Despair has set in. Mary and Martha expect God to act in a certain way. God didn't. All seems lost. And that space, most of our faith operates in that space there, where that old understanding has collapsed. The new one has not yet arrived. And we see it as an obstacle to our growth and the rest of our life. But actually, it's the condition of the growth of it. It's where we release the frameworks that no longer hold our experience and become capable of receiving something larger. And the story of Lazarus is not a story of how faith fixes everything. It's a story about what love can do when we stop insisting it work on our terms. And so Jesus raises up Lazarus and he tells the community standing around the tomb, unbind him and let him go. He was wrapped in this whole burial shawl. And I think that has some theological intention to it, because the miracle of new life, that's God's prerogative. But then the liberation from the grave clothes of injustice and exclusion, that's our job. That's our work to do. He gives that to the community. Unbind him and let him go. That's what the power of community is supposed to do. That's what the church ecclesiology should be built around. Not the generator of resurrection life, but the community that unbinds those who are tangled in those old grave clothes. And here the kingdom does not arrive in Jerusalem's halls of power. It rises from Bethany's humble streets. And so we have been given the command, unbind your neighbor. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed within a generation, exactly as Jesus predicted it. Not because God is cruel, but just because the systems built on domination carry the seeds of their own destruction. And the way of love, even when it looks like losing, is the only way that holds. Next week, Jesus is going to enter Jerusalem on a donkey for the triumphal entry for Palm Sunday and warn the city that its refusal to embrace love over power will be its undoing. And the trajectory from Bethany to Jerusalem is not incidental. It's the arc of the whole gospel. He's been going this direction. And we can wake up to the presence of divine love in places of poverty and weakness, not to glorify those states, but to declare that the Jerusalem strongholds of power that enforce them on others is incapable of bringing about authentic human transformation, regardless of their claims to correct belief and required affiliation to enter. And so our command here is simple. Let's go to Bethany. Let's unbind our neighbor. Maybe it's your own internal Bethany of the places that you have excluded parts of yourself, and maybe it's people around you in your community. But the command remains. Go to Bethany and unbind your neighbor.